Changing a Peco buffer stop, the rail type, to look like a South African buffer stop. I have one of the South African buffer stops, and as you can see, but there is one major difference between the two, except for the bought South African one costing a fortune. The Peco one can be changed to look reasonably similar. So now we will have a look at what to do to make the Peco buffer stop look more like the South African buffer stop. What you will need is the following tools: a 2mm drill bit, or if you have got the correct range, a 1.8mm drill bit and drill, a file, normally a large flat file will suffice, then some nickel silver rail. Most of us modelers who have built a layout have little pieces of rail that were cut off to make the tracks fit. So 2 pieces of the nickel silver rail, a fine liner or felt tip marker to mark things, a soldering iron and solder and flux, white paint and paintbrush, some glue, preferably a rubber-based glue, and a side cutter, or if you have a Dremel with a cut-off tool or a rail nipper, that will work as well. And you will also need a hobby knife. That I think will only be used once. So let us jump straight into it. On the Peco buffer stop, the beam, if you are going to use this, because I will show you 2 methods. On this one there's a little lamp that I have never ever seen on the South African Railways buffer stops. So simply use the knife and discard that. Then the next step is painting all the parts to a white. That is the color that all the South African buffer stops are. And once it is painted, I will show you one little trick if you want to use the Peco buffer stop 90% or 99% as is. It's the easiest way. The other one is a little more involved and requires some soldering and some filing, but it looks a bit better. Here we have a buffer stop that has been painted, and as you might notice, a small block has also been added on the buffer beam, and that block comes from a tie from a piece of track that has been painted white, and then you simply cut out the middle piece and use the glue. I've used just some normal clear glue to attach that to the buffer beam. That is the easy method to make the buffer stops look like the South African one. You can still tell there's quite a difference, but if you are just modeling representative, that it represents the buffer stop, that is acceptable in my book. The South African buffer stop uses 2 pieces of rail as the buffer beam, and to duplicate that is not very difficult, but it does require a bit of work. In order to do that and even still use the Peco's sides of the buffer stop, you will need 2 pieces of rail and a pen and the original buffer stop from the Peco buffer stop, the original buffer beam. So what you do is to take these 2 and try and get them that you have the bottom web facing upwards, and then take the felt tip marker and line them up and mark the correct length. You do that on both of them, getting the length the same. And then you cut them on that length. Okay, once you have cut them, use the file just to smooth the edges where they have been cut. And that one. just so that we have a nice rail profile. The next step I will not show you, but that is basically to solder the two ends together, the two flat web pieces, that you have that profile, or a try the other side where I haven't filed. It might be better to show you the profile. And once you have done that, just a tip, in order to do that, some press stick, or known across the world by all different names as blue tack or just tack. Place the piece of rail with the rail head down, and place the next piece of rail next to it, also rail head down, and then squeeze them together. Once they are nicely together, add your soldering flux and heat them up and add solder, and they will make quite a good joint. This is what the two pieces of rail looks like when it is soldered together. And I've also gone ahead and drilled two holes after marking them out exactly where the holes in the Peco buffer stop is. Then also using the felt tip marker for that. And once the two holes are drilled, you paint this piece white, and then it simply goes onto the existing Peco sides into that two holes. The pins from the Peco sides just fit into those two holes, and there we have a semi-South African looking buffer stop. This still of course needs to be painted, and then of course also the little white block needs to be glued to the front. The reason for using a sleeper, that was normally a wooden block that has been used in the front on the two pieces of rail and bolted to those two pieces of rail, and the sleepers already have wood grain in them, which makes this looks a bit more realistic. And there is the final product after it has been painted, and the two pieces of rail and the wooden block cut from a plastic sleeper and painted white has been added. So that is a reasonable representation. I accept it on my layout, especially also from a cost perspective, where the Peco buffer stops is about the quarter to a third of the price of one of the South African buffer stops.